What if the moment he destroyed her was the moment she took everything back? The conference room was wrapped in glass and power, 30 floors above Manhattan, where the skyline shimmered like a promise only the ruthless could keep, and at the center of it all stood Ava Brooks, her posture straight, her expression composed, her dark eyes steady as if the tension in the air belonged to someone else entirely. While across the polished mahogany table Ethan Carter adjusted his cufflinks with the kind of calm that came from knowing he owned the room, the company, and, until this moment, her. No one spoke when he finally looked up, because when Ethan Carter looked up, people listened. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice low and measured, cutting clean through the silence. "Ava Brooks is suspended pending investigation for financial misconduct." The words didn't echo, but they landed, heavy and deliberate, like a verdict already sealed. A flicker of movement passed through the room. Side glances, subtle shifts, the quiet hum of disbelief. But no one dared question him. Not in this room, not under those lights. Ava didn't react. She didn't blink, didn't interrupt, didn't offer a defense that everyone silently expected from the woman who had built the company's financial backbone with precision no one else could match. Instead, she let the silence stretch, controlled, intentional, as if she were measuring something far more valuable than reputation. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on her, waiting, perhaps, for resistance, for emotion, for anything that would confirm he still understood her. But Ava Brooks had learned long ago that power didn't live in reaction. It lived in restraint. Slowly, she reached for her left hand. The diamond caught the light first, a sharp glint against her deep brown skin, a symbol that had once meant partnership, loyalty, a shared empire built behind closed doors. For a moment, it seemed to hold the entire room in place. Then, without a word, she slipped the ring off. The sound it made when it touched the table was almost nothing, a soft, precise click, but it was enough to fracture the illusion everyone had been holding on to. Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly, a detail so small most would miss it, but Ava didn't. She noticed everything. She always had. "Is there anything you'd like to say for the record?" the head of legal asked cautiously, his voice careful, as if stepping through glass. Ava lifted her gaze, not to the room, not to the board, but directly to Ethan. And for the first time, there was something different in her eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but clarity. Clean. Unshakable. "No," she said simply. One word. Controlled. Final. Then she stood, smoothing the sleeve of her tailored black blazer, as if closing a chapter no one else realized had already ended. Around her, phones remained face down, but everyone was watching, memorizing, sensing something they couldn't yet name. Ava Brooks walked out of that room without looking back, her heels striking the marble floor in steady rhythm, each step quieter than the last, until the glass doors sealed behind her and the empire Ethan believed he controlled returned to silence. But silence, Ava knew, was never empty. It was where everything began. Hours later, in a city that never truly slept, her phone lit up in the darkness of her apartment, the screen casting a cool glow across her face as she read the message without surprise. "It's time to activate what you built." Ava didn't smile. She didn't hesitate. She simply reached for her laptop, the same calm precision in her movements as before, because the woman who had just been suspended was the same woman who had written the system that decided who truly owned everything by morning. The city had a way of pretending nothing had happened, its lights still glowing, its streets still alive, as if reputations were not destroyed in glass towers every single day. But inside Ava Brooks' apartment, everything was precise, deliberate, and moving forward exactly as planned. She sat at her desk with the skyline stretched wide behind her, her reflection faint in the window, superimposed over a city that had never once handed her anything without a price. Her laptop screen illuminated her face, calm and unreadable, as lines of data unfolded beneath her fingertips, familiar structures she had designed years ago when no one thought to question how deeply she understood the system they all depended on. Every account, every subsidiary, every silent agreement between investors who trusted results more than titles, it was all there, layered beneath the surface like architecture no one could see until it shifted. Her phone buzzed again, a second message from the same secure line. "The board is already asking questions." Ava did not respond immediately. She did not rush. Timing was not about speed, it was about precision. Across the city, Ethan Carter was still in his office, still standing in the aftershock of his own decision, though he would not call it that. To him, it had been control, necessary, calculated, a move to protect the company from what he believed was a threat. The problem was, Ethan Carter had always believed control meant visibility, signatures, titles, the obvious markers of power. He had never learned to look for the quiet ones. Back in her apartment, Ava opened a file labeled with nothing more than a date. Inside it were contracts, original drafts, early-stage agreements that had never made it into the official narrative of the company's rise. She remembered each one. Late nights, closed rooms, conversations where her voice had been measured, her suggestions accepted, but her name never placed where it should have been. It had never bothered her. Not then, because Ava Brooks had never built for recognition. She had built for inevitability. She clicked into the first clause, her eyes scanning the language with effortless familiarity. It was all still intact. Nothing had been altered. No one had thought to touch it. A faint shift of her fingers and an email began to draft itself, addressed to 3 names that did not appear on any public investor list. Men and women who had backed decisions, not faces. People who understood value without needing it to be announced in a press release. She did not explain. She did not need to. She attached the documents. She added one line. It is time. Send. Across the city, responses came faster than most would expect. Confirmations, acknowledgments, a quiet alignment happening beneath the surface of a company that believed it had already defined its own hierarchy. Ava closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in doubt, not in hesitation, but in recognition. This was not revenge. This was correction. She stood, walking toward the window, the cool glass beneath her fingertips as she looked out over the skyline, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady. Somewhere below, taxis moved like streams of light, people rushing toward futures they could not yet see, and for a moment, the city felt smaller, contained, like something she could fold into her palm if she chose to. Her phone rang this time, not a message. She answered without looking at the number. It is done, the voice on the other end said, professional, neutral, but edged with something close to respect. The transfer will finalize by morning. Ava nodded once, though no one could see it. Thank you. She ended the call and returned to her desk, closing her laptop with a soft, decisive motion. There was nothing left to prepare. No speech to rehearse. No argument to build. Everything that mattered had already been written, long before anyone thought to question her place. In a different part of the city, Ethan finally sat down, the weight of the day settling in ways he did not yet understand. His reflection staring back at him from the darkened window of his office, sharp, controlled, and completely unaware that control had already shifted. He reached for his phone, scrolling through messages, board updates, legal confirmations, all of it routine, all of it familiar, until one notification appeared that did not belong to the pattern. His access credentials had been flagged. Temporary. Pending review. His brow tightened, confusion cutting through his usual composure as he tried again. The same result, the same quiet denial. It was subtle, almost nothing. But for a man like Ethan Carter, it was enough to feel the first fracture. Back in her apartment, Ava turned off the lights, letting the city become the only illumination in the room as she stood in the silence she had always trusted. The same silence that had followed her out of that boardroom. The same silence that now held something entirely different. Not emptiness, not loss, but the quiet certainty of a system returning to the one who had built it from the beginning. Morning in Manhattan did not arrive gently. It arrived with light that cut through glass and steel, revealing everything that had shifted overnight whether the world was ready to see it or not. And inside the lobby of Carter Global Headquarters, the usual rhythm of polished shoes and quiet greetings faltered for the first time in years as Ethan Carter stepped through the revolving doors with the same measured confidence he had carried for a decade, his presence still commanding, his expression still composed, but something unseen had already begun to move against him. The security guard at the front desk hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, a pause so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Ethan noticed everything. Or at least he believed he did. Good morning, sir, the guard said, though the tone lacked its usual certainty, and when Ethan moved toward the private elevator, his key card met the scanner with a soft, mechanical rejection. Once, twice, a third time. The quiet beep did not change, and neither did the message that appeared on the screen. Access denied. Ethan's jaw tightened, a controlled shift, his hand lowering slowly as he turned toward the guard, who was already reaching for a phone, already avoiding direct eye contact. There must be a mistake, Ethan said, his voice calm, but colder now, sharper around the edges. Of course, sir. The guard replied quickly, though his fingers moved with urgency that betrayed something else entirely. Around them, employees began to slow, conversations dimming into whispers that floated just beneath the surface of professionalism. Curiosity mixing with something more dangerous, something closer to realization. Ethan's phone buzzed in his hand, a notification from the board, marked urgent, and for the first time in years, he did not control the information before it reached him. He opened it. His eyes moved across the message once, then again, as if repetition might change what it said. Emergency board meeting. Immediate attendance required. New acting executive authority recognized. The words were precise, legal, irreversible. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself, recalibrating, because this was not how power worked, not in his world, not in a company he had built, expanded, dominated. And yet, something in the structure had shifted without his permission. I will take the stairs, he said finally, his voice returning to that familiar control, the mask sliding back into place as he moved past the elevator and toward the private stairwell, each step upward deliberate, measured, as if reclaiming ground that had somehow been taken without a fight. Floor by floor, the building remained the same glass offices, the same polished floors, the same employees who straightened when they saw him. But their eyes lingered longer now, uncertainty flickering where confidence used to live. By the time Ethan reached the executive level, the doors to the boardroom were already closed, and the quiet outside felt different, heavier, like a threshold that had already decided who belonged on the other side. He did not hesitate. He never had. The door opened beneath his hand with the same smooth motion it always had, but what waited inside was not the room he expected. The board members were seated, their posture formal, their expressions carefully neutral, and at the head of the table, where Ethan Carter had always sat, someone else was already there. Ava Brooks did not stand when he entered. She did not turn immediately. She simply finished reviewing the document in front of her, her pen resting lightly between her fingers, before lifting her gaze with that same calm precision that had defined her in every room she had ever entered. The silence that followed was not shock. It was recognition. Ethan stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes locking onto hers, searching for explanation, for error, for anything that would restore the order he understood. "What is this?" he asked, the question controlled, but edged now with something deeper, something unfamiliar. Ava tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not aggressive, simply acknowledging the moment as it was. "This," she said, her voice even, measured, carrying effortlessly across the room, "is the result of what you chose not to see." A document slid across the table, guided by one of the board members, stopping just within Ethan's reach, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan stepped forward, picking it up, his eyes scanning the pages, the signatures, the clauses, the dates, all of it unmistakably real, all of it legally binding, all of it bearing his own authorization from years ago when the foundation of the company had been something he trusted without question. His hand tightened slightly around the paper, the first visible crack in a structure he had believed was unbreakable. Ava watched him, not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Clean. Absolute. "You built a company," she continued quietly, "but I built the system that decides who owns it." The room remained still, every person present understanding that something irreversible had just been revealed, something that had never needed to announce itself until now. Ethan looked up again, meeting her gaze, and for the first time, the man who had controlled everything realized that control had never truly belonged to him at all. No one in the room moved, not immediately, because power did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived in silence, so complete it forced everyone to reconsider what they thought they understood, and Ethan Carter stood there with the document still in his hand, the weight of it far heavier than paper should ever be, his eyes tracing signatures he recognized, dates he remembered approving, clauses he had once skimmed with confidence, never imagining they would one day redefine his position entirely. "This is not possible," he said finally, his voice controlled but tighter now, each word measured as if precision alone could undo what had already been set into motion. And yet the room did not respond the way it once would have. No immediate agreement, no subtle alignment bending toward him, only a stillness that confirmed what Ava had already made clear. She remained seated, composed, her posture effortless, as if the chair at the head of the table had always belonged to her, and the years she had spent just beside it had been nothing more than preparation. "It is already done," one of the senior board members said carefully, his tone respectful but firm, the kind of tone reserved for facts that no longer required debate. Ethan's gaze shifted from Ava to the board, searching, calculating, recalibrating, because this was not just about documents. This was about influence, about loyalty, about the invisible lines of power that defined who stood where when everything changed, and for the first time, those lines were not where he expected them to be. Ava watched him without interruption, without urgency, allowing the realization to settle in its own time, because she understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that true power did not rush to prove itself. It waited until it no longer needed to. "You signed the restructuring authority 3 years ago," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, as if she were guiding him through a memory he had not valued enough to keep close. "You wanted flexibility. You wanted protection against external takeover." Ethan's brow tightened, the memory surfacing now, late nights, rapid expansion, a period where speed had mattered more than scrutiny, where trust had replaced verification because the system had been working, because she had been there. "You drafted it," he said, the realization cutting through his voice, not accusation, not yet, but something sharper, something closer to understanding the scale of what had been overlooked. Ava inclined her head slightly, not denying it, not emphasizing it, simply acknowledging. "What had always been true. I built what you needed," she replied, and there was no emotion in it, only clarity. The room remained silent again, but this silence was different, heavier with recognition, each person present understanding that what had happened was not sudden, not impulsive, but the result of years of structure placed carefully beneath the surface. Ethan set the document down on the table with controlled precision, his movements deliberate, his composure returning in layers, because he was not a man who unraveled easily, not in public, not in front of a board that had once followed his lead without question. "Then this is how you choose to play it," he said, his tone steadier now, though something beneath it had shifted, something less certain, less absolute. Ava's gaze did not waver. "This is not a game," she said quietly. "This is alignment." The words settled into the space between them, simple, undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan understood exactly what she meant, that this was not about taking something from him. It was about correcting something that had never been properly seen, never properly valued, never properly acknowledged. Around the table, the board members remained composed, but their attention had already shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to confirm where authority now rested, enough to make the next moments inevitable. Effective immediately, another voice began, reading from a prepared statement. Executive control is recognized under the authority of the majority stakeholder agreement as amended under Clause 17. The language was precise, legal, final, and as it continued, Ethan listened, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but absorbing each word as it confirmed what Ava had already established without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without needing to. When the statement ended, the room remained still once more, but this time, the stillness belonged to her. Ava stood then, slowly, her movement controlled, her presence filling the space not through force, but through certainty, and as she gathered the documents in front of her, there was no hesitation, no doubt, no trace of the woman who had walked out of this same building the night before under accusation and silence. She stepped forward, not toward Ethan, but past him, her path clear, her direction unquestioned, and as she reached the door, she paused just long enough to speak again, her voice steady, quiet, but impossible to ignore. "You did not lose your company overnight," she said. You lost at the moment you stopped seeing who was actually holding it together. Then she opened the door and walked out, leaving behind a room that no longer belonged to the man who had once believed it always would. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different as Ava Brooks stepped into it. Not louder, not brighter, but aligned in a way that only those who understood power could recognize, because the same employees who had whispered the night before now straightened instinctively as she passed, their eyes shifting not with curiosity, but with awareness, the kind that came when a truth no one had acknowledged finally became visible. She did not slow down, her pace measured, her expression composed, the echo of her heels against the marble floor steady and controlled, each step reinforcing something that had never needed announcement, only timing. Behind her, the boardroom door remained closed, but the shift inside it had already begun to ripple outward, subtle changes in posture, in tone, in the quiet language of hierarchy that defined who spoke first and who listened. Ava reached the executive corridor, the space that had once belonged to Ethan Carter without question, where every detail had been curated to reflect his version of control: dark wood, muted lighting, an atmosphere designed to command silence before a word was even spoken. And for a brief moment, she paused, not in hesitation, but in recognition, because she knew exactly how much of this had been built with her input, her structure, her precision hidden behind decisions that had never carried her name. She moved forward again, pushing open the door to the corner office that overlooked the city, the same office where Ethan had stood just hours before believing everything was still his. And as the door closed behind her, the room settled into a new kind of stillness, one that did not resist her presence, but accepted it as inevitable. Ava walked to the desk, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface, not claiming it, not marking it, simply acknowledging the transition as complete. Then she turned toward the windows, the skyline stretching out beneath her like a map she already understood, each building, each reflection, each layer of the city mirroring the system she had constructed piece by piece without ever needing recognition for it. Her phone vibrated again, but this time the messages were different. Not warnings, not questions, but confirmations, investors aligning, departments adjusting, legal teams finalizing language that reflected what had already been decided long before sunrise, and she read each one with the same calm focus, responding only when necessary, because control did not require constant movement, it required precision. Downstairs, the atmosphere had shifted further, conversations quieter but more intentional, employees checking internal systems, noticing updates they had never expected to see, reporting structures adjusted, access levels recalibrated, the invisible architecture of the company rearranging itself in real time. And with each passing minute, the reality became harder to ignore, harder to question, until it simply existed as fact. Ethan Carter remained in the boardroom longer than anyone anticipated, not because he did not understand what had happened, but because understanding required him to revisit every moment he had dismissed, every decision he had signed without reading beyond the surface, every instance where Ava Brooks had been present, precise, and quietly essential. When he finally stepped out, the hallway greeted him differently, not with defiance, not with disrespect, but with distance, a subtle recalibration that no one announced but everyone felt. And for the first time, Ethan noticed the absence of something he had always assumed would be there: unquestioned loyalty. He walked toward his office, his stride still controlled, his posture still composed, but when he reached the door, he stopped, not because it was locked, not because he could not enter, but because something inside him recognized that the space beyond it no longer belonged to him in the way it once had. Inside, Ava stood by the window, the city reflected behind her, her silhouette steady, her presence filling the room without effort, and when she turned to face him, there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction in the shift that had taken place. Only clarity, the same clarity she had carried from the beginning, the same clarity he had chosen not to see. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because some truths did not need words to be understood, and in that silence, everything that had changed settled fully into place. Ethan stepped inside slowly, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound, and for the first time, the man who had once controlled every outcome stood in a room where control no longer answered to him, and across from him, The woman he had underestimated simply waited, not to prove anything, not to explain, but because she no longer needed to. The silence inside the office did not feel empty. It felt precise, like a balance that had finally corrected itself after years of leaning in the wrong direction. And Ethan Carter stood just a few steps inside the door, his eyes fixed on Ava Brooks, as if he were still searching for the version of her he believed he understood, the one who had stood beside him, not in front of him, the one who had spoken in measured tones, but never claimed the room the way she did now. Ava did not move toward him, did not gesture for him to sit, did not offer the familiar structure of conversation he was used to controlling. She simply held his gaze with that same calm certainty, allowing the weight of the moment to exist without interruption. "You planned this," Ethan said finally, his voice lower than before, not raised, not accusing in volume, but sharpened by realization, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. Ava tilted her head slightly, considering the word, and for a moment, the faintest shift of expression crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite dismissal, something more measured than both. "No," she replied evenly. "I prepared." The distinction settled between them, subtle but absolute, and Ethan understood it immediately, because planning implied reaction, but preparation implied foresight, something he had underestimated, something he had mistaken for support rather than strategy. He took another step into the room, his movements controlled, reclaiming composure piece by piece, because even now, even here, he was not a man who allowed himself to unravel. "You could have said something," he continued, his tone steadier now, searching for ground he could still stand on. "You could have made your position clear." Ava's gaze did not soften, but it shifted, just slightly, as if she were looking not at the man in front of her, but at the pattern behind him, the years of decisions that had led to this exact moment. "I did," she said quietly. "You just did not listen." The words were not sharp, not delivered with force, but they carried something heavier than confrontation, something closer to truth, and for a brief second, Ethan had no immediate response, because somewhere beneath his control, he recognized it. He moved toward the desk, placing his hand lightly against its edge, not claiming it, not yet, but anchoring himself in a space that had once responded entirely to him. "So this is it," he said, his eyes returning to hers. "You take everything and walk away." Ava's expression remained unchanged, composed, precise, but there was something else now, something that had always been there but had never needed to surface until this moment. "I am not taking anything," she replied. "I am stepping into what was already mine." The distinction was clear, undeniable, and Ethan felt it settle in a way no legal document ever could, because this was not just about ownership, it was about recognition, about the difference between what was seen and what was real. Outside the office, the building continued to adjust, the quiet hum of a company recalibrating itself, systems updating, leadership aligning, and inside, the distance between them was no longer defined by proximity, but by understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, his posture straightening, his expression returning to that familiar control, but there was a fracture now, not visible to most, but present enough that he could feel it, a shift in the foundation he had relied on for years. "And what happens to me?" he asked, not as a demand, not as a challenge, but as a question he had never needed to ask before. Ava studied him for a moment, not with judgment, not with sympathy, but with clarity, the same clarity that had guided every decision she had made long before this room, long before this morning. "That depends on what you choose to see now," she said, her voice steady, unhurried. "Because this was never about removing you, Ethan. It was about removing what you refused to acknowledge." The words did not offer comfort, but they did not close the door either, and for the first time since he had walked into the building, Ethan realized that this moment was not an ending, not in the way he had imagined, but something else entirely, something that required him to confront not what he had lost, but what he had failed to understand. Ava turned slightly, her attention shifting back toward the window, the city stretching out beneath her once more, unchanged, and yet completely different, because perspective had shifted, and in that shift, everything else followed. She did not dismiss him, did not instruct him to leave, because she no longer needed to control the outcome of his next move. And as the silence settled again, it no longer belonged to uncertainty, it belonged to choice, the kind that defined what came next for both of them, but especially for the man who had just learned that power, once misunderstood, does not return the same way twice. The silence did not break when Ethan Carter chose not to speak again. It deepened, stretching across the office like a line neither of them needed to cross. And for the first time in years, he understood that control was not something he could reclaim by filling the space with words, because Ava Brooks was not waiting for his reaction. She was waiting for his understanding, and those were not the same thing. He stepped back slightly from the desk, not retreating, not surrendering, but adjusting, recalibrating the way a man does when he realizes the rules he has played by no longer apply in the same way. And his gaze shifted briefly toward the window, toward the city that had always reflected his success back at him without question. Only now it looked different, not smaller, not distant, but no longer centered around him. "You changed everything overnight," he said, his voice quieter now, less edged, more deliberate, as if each word required a different kind of precision than before. Ava did not turn immediately, her eyes still on the skyline, her reflection faint against the glass, steady and composed, and when she finally spoke, her tone remained even, unshaken. "No," she said softly. "I revealed what was already in place." The distinction settled again, just as before, and this time Ethan did not challenge it, because somewhere in the space between them, he had begun to see the pattern, the years of quiet decisions, of systems built beneath his visibility, of trust placed in structure without questioning the hands that shaped it. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing not from defeat, but from recognition, the kind that shifts a man internally before it ever shows externally. "And you never thought to tell me," he said, not accusing now, but searching, trying to trace the point where everything had diverged without him noticing. Ava turned then, fully facing him, her posture straight, her presence grounded in something far more stable than position or title. "I did not think I needed to prove my value to someone who was supposed to see it," she replied, her voice calm, but carrying weight that did not need emphasis. Ethan absorbed that, the words settling deeper than anything else she had said, because they pointed not to a moment, but to a pattern, to a series of decisions he had made without realizing what they were costing him. He nodded once, a small motion, controlled, acknowledging something he could not undo, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt less like opposition and more like clarity finally reached from opposite sides. Outside, the company continued its quiet transformation, departments aligning under new directives, communication shifting tone, subtle but unmistakable, and inside the office, the air itself seemed to hold that same adjustment, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, simply real. Ethan moved toward the seating area near the window, not waiting for permission, not assuming authority, but choosing to remain in the space on different terms than before, and as he sat, his posture remained upright, composed, though something in his expression had softened, not in weakness, but in awareness. "So what happens now?" he asked again. But this time the question carried something different, not entitlement, not expectation, but openness, a willingness to hear an answer that might not serve him the way answers once had. Ava studied him for a moment, longer than before, as if measuring not his words, but the shift behind them, and then she walked toward him, her steps measured, her presence steady, stopping just short of where he sat now, she said, her voice quiet but clear. "You decide whether you want to understand the system you helped build, or remain outside of it." The words did not offer position, did not promise restoration, but they did leave space, and that space was intentional, because Ava Brooks had never been interested in destruction, only in alignment. Ethan looked up at her, really looked this time, not at the role she had played, not at the position he had assigned her, but at the person who had stood beside him all along, holding together structures he had benefited from without fully recognizing. And in that moment, the realization settled fully, not as a loss, but as a shift in perspective that could not be undone. He nodded again, slower this time, more certain, not because he had regained control, but because he had finally seen what control actually required. Ava stepped back slightly, giving him the space to process, to choose, because she no longer needed to define his place in what came next. And as the city continued its endless movement beyond the glass, the office held something new, not tension, not conflict, but the quiet beginning of a different kind of power, one that no longer needed to prove itself to exist. The room did not return to what it had been, because once truth settled into a space, it changed the way everything inside it moved, and Ava Brooks understood that more than anyone, which was why she did not rush the next moment, did not fill the silence with instructions or declarations. She simply allowed it to exist, knowing that realignment was not forced, it was absorbed. Ethan Carter remained seated, his posture still composed, but no longer rigid, his gaze no longer fixed on control, but shifting, recalculating in a way that was quieter, deeper, as if he were finally tracing the architecture beneath the surface rather than the structure above it. Outside the office, the company had already begun to speak a different language, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle shifts that only those paying attention would recognize. Emails phrased with new authority, assistants adjusting schedules without needing confirmation, departments moving in alignment with directives that had not yet been announced publicly, because power, once established, did not wait for permission to be acknowledged. Ava moved toward the desk again, not to claim it, not to assert dominance, but to continue what needed to be done, her fingers gliding across the tablet as she reviewed the first set of updates, her expression unchanged, her focus precise, because transition was not a moment, it was a process, and she had always been built for process. There will be a statement released within the hour, she said calmly, her voice steady, not directed at Ethan as a command, but placed into the space as fact. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. Ethan nodded slightly, not out of agreement, but out of recognition that the tone mattered, that the company did not need spectacle, it needed stability, and that had always been something Ava understood better than anyone. And my role, he said after a moment, the question returning, but this time without resistance, without edge, simply seeking definition within a structure he was only now beginning to see fully. Ava paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk, her eyes lifting to meet his, and for a brief moment, there was something almost reflective in her gaze, as if she were considering not just the present, but the weight of everything that had led them here. That depends on whether you want a position, she said, her tone even, or a purpose. The distinction was deliberate, and Ethan felt it immediately, because for years, he had held both without questioning the difference, and now, only one remained available to him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly, the movement controlled, but carrying a shift that could not be reversed, because understanding, once it arrived, did not leave quietly. And if I choose purpose, he said, his voice quieter now, more grounded, what does that look like? Ava studied him for a moment, not measuring his words, but the intention behind them, and then she stepped away from the desk, closing the distance between them just enough to redefine the space, not as opposition, but as alignment in progress. It looks like learning what you overlooked, she said, her voice steady, and deciding whether you are willing to build with it, instead of above it. The words settled into the room with a kind of finality that did not close doors, but redefined them, and Ethan understood that this was not an offer in the traditional sense, not a negotiation, not a compromise, but an opportunity that required something he had not been asked to give before, perspective. Outside, the first internal memo was released, concise, controlled, announcing a leadership transition framed not as disruption, but as strategic evolution, and within minutes, responses began to circulate, not chaotic, not resistant, but aligned, as if the company itself had been waiting for this shift without realizing it. Ava returned her attention briefly to the screen, confirming the distribution, the tone, the timing, and then she turned back toward Ethan, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, because she had never needed the moment to validate her, only to reveal what had always been there. Ethan rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate, his posture no longer defined by control, but by awareness, and as he stood there in the office that no longer belonged to him in the way it once had, he realized something that had been hidden in plain sight all along, that power was not lost in a single moment, it was misplaced over time, and what Ava had done was not take it, but return it to where it had always existed. He nodded once more, not to her, not to the room, but to the understanding that had finally settled within him, and in that quiet acknowledgement, something shifted again, not in position, not in title, but in the way he would move forward from this moment on. The statement did not ripple through the company like a shockwave. It settled like a quiet correction, precise and controlled, and within minutes the narrative had already begun to reshape itself, not through chaos, but through clarity, the kind that does not ask for belief, only recognition. Ava Brooks stood near the window as the city continued its rhythm below, her reflection steady against the glass, while inside the system she had built, every adjustment moved exactly as intended, seamless, efficient, inevitable. Behind her, Ethan Carter remained still for a moment longer, absorbing not just what had changed, but how it had changed, because this was not disruption, it was continuity, just no longer centered around him. He walked slowly across the office, not toward the desk, but toward the window, stopping a few feet from Ava, his gaze shifting outward, following the lines of the skyline, as if searching for something familiar within it. "You designed this to hold without you being seen," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization that had finally reached its full shape. Ava did not turn, but her voice came just as steady as before. "I designed it to hold, period," she replied. Visibility was never the goal. Ethan nodded slightly, understanding now that what he had mistaken for absence had always been presence, just not in the form he had been trained to recognize. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was functional, the kind that exists when two people finally understand the same truth from different directions. Ava moved back toward the desk, reviewing the next sequence of updates. Her focus unwavering, while Ethan remained by the window, his reflection now sharing the glass with hers, no longer dominating it, simply existing alongside it. "The board will want to stabilize external perception," he said after a moment, his tone returning to something more familiar, not control, but contribution, the shift subtle, but real. Ava glanced at him briefly, acknowledging the input without needing to evaluate it. "They already are," she said. "The narrative is not about change. It is about continuity with better alignment." Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a soft exhale of recognition, because that was exactly what the company needed, not a story of replacement, but a story of evolution, something he had once understood instinctively, but had allowed to become secondary to expansion, to speed, to control. He turned slightly, facing her more directly now, his posture different, not diminished, but adjusted, grounded in something less rigid, more aware. "And where do I fit into that narrative?" he asked, not with urgency, not with demand, but with clarity, because this time, he understood that the answer would not be shaped around him, but would require him to shape himself around it. Ava closed the file in front of her, the motion soft but definitive, and looked at him fully, her gaze steady, measuring not his position, but his readiness. "That depends on whether you want to be part of the system," she said, "or remain a symbol of what it used to be." The distinction was sharper this time, more defined, and Ethan felt it settle without resistance, because he could already see the difference, could already feel the weight of each option in a way he had never needed to before. Outside, the company continued to move, departments aligning with new directives, leadership structures adjusting without friction, because the foundation beneath them had never changed, only the recognition of it had. Inside the office, the air held something new, not tension, not uncertainty, but direction, the kind that does not need to be announced to be followed. Ethan stepped away from the window, moving closer to the desk, not reclaiming space, but entering it with a different understanding, and for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the surface that had once defined his authority, now redefined by something he had not seen coming, but could no longer deny. "Then I need to understand it," he said finally, his voice steady, grounded, carrying a decision rather than a question. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not approval, not satisfaction, but acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. "Then start by listening," she replied. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted once more, not in power, not in title, but in perspective, because for the first time since he had walked into that building, Ethan Carter was not trying to regain control, he was choosing to understand it, and Ava Brooks, who had never needed the moment to validate her, simply continued forward, knowing that what came next would not be built on what had been lost, but on what had finally been seen. The shift did not announce itself with noise, but it became undeniable in the hours that followed, woven into every decision, every interaction, every quiet adjustment that carried the company forward without hesitation. And Ava Brooks remained at the center of it, not as a figure demanding attention, but as the axis everything naturally aligned around. The office around her had not changed in design. The same dark wood, the same skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. But the energy within it had recalibrated, no longer built on command, but on clarity, and that difference was subtle to most, but absolute to those who understood what real leadership required. Ethan Carter stood across from her, no longer positioned as opposition, no longer trying to reclaim ground that had already shifted, but present in a way that was new even to himself, his posture steady, his expression composed, yet carrying a depth of awareness that had not existed the day before. Ava moved through the next set of updates with quiet efficiency, reviewing financial projections, confirming investor responses, aligning departments that had already begun to operate under her structure without resistance, because the system recognized her long before the title did. The transition will be finalized by the end of the day, she said, her voice even, not a declaration, but a confirmation of what was already in motion. Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze following the data on the screen, not as a detached observer, but as someone beginning to see the architecture beneath it, the logic, the precision, the intention that had always been there. You anticipated every reaction, he said after a moment, not impressed, not surprised, but acknowledging something he could no longer deny. Ava did not look up immediately, her attention still on the details, because anticipation had never been about predicting people, it had been about understanding patterns. I understood the system, she replied simply. People move within it. Ethan absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the truth of it, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to challenge or redefine it, because he could see it now, not as a theory, but as something actively unfolding around him. He stepped closer to the desk, his movements measured, his presence no longer imposing, but intentional, and as he looked at the screen beside her, he recognized elements he had once approved without question, structures he had trusted without fully understanding the depth behind them. And I signed all of it, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, the realization settling in layers, not as regret, but as clarity. Ava glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged, because this was not new information, only newly understood. You approved what you believed in, she said. You just did not see all of it. The distinction remained consistent, precise, and Ethan accepted it without resistance, because it no longer felt like correction, it felt like truth. Outside the office, the company continued to stabilize, the initial uncertainty replaced by a sense of direction that spread through departments with quiet confidence. Meetings rescheduled, priorities realigned, and within a few hours, the narrative had already shifted from question to acceptance, because results did not argue, they simply proved themselves. Ava stepped away from the desk again, walking toward the window, her reflection steady against the city beyond, and for a moment, she allowed herself to pause, not in hesitation, but in recognition of the moment as it was, not as something dramatic, not as a victory, but as a transition that had always been inevitable. Behind her, Ethan remained where he was, watching not her, but the system she had set in motion, the precision of it, the way it held without strain, without disruption, and in that observation, something within him settled into place, something that had been resisting since the moment he lost control, now shifting into something else. Entirely. You never needed the title, he said finally, his voice calm, grounded, carrying a different kind of understanding. Ava turned slightly, her gaze meeting his, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something softer in her expression, not emotion, not vulnerability, but acknowledgement. No, she said. But the system did. The answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened, because it was never about recognition for her. It was about alignment for the structure she had built. Ethan nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, because now he understood that the shift was not personal, it was structural, not about replacing him, but about restoring balance, and in that understanding, the loss of control no longer felt like collapse, it felt like exposure. Ava returned her attention to the city for a moment longer, then back to the work that remained, because transition was not complete until it was sustained, and she had always been someone who finished what she built. In the quiet of that office, with the skyline reflecting a future neither of them had fully seen before, the next phase began, not with conflict, not with resistance, but with a clarity that no longer needed to be proven, only carried forward. The company no longer questioned the shift, it absorbed it, adapted to it, moved with it in a way that made the transition feel less like an event and more like a correction that had been overdue. And by midday, the structure Ava Brooks had set into motion was no longer new. It was simply the way things worked. Meetings that once waited for approval now began on time. Decisions that once circled endlessly now moved forward with clarity. And throughout the building, there was a quiet efficiency that had not existed before, not because people were working harder, but because they were finally working within a system that made sense. Ava stood at the head of the conference table once more, not for confrontation, not for announcement, but for alignment, her presence steady, her voice measured as she outlined the next phase of strategy, each word precise, each decision grounded in logic that required no defense. Around her, the executives listened, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because the results were already visible, already undeniable. Ethan Carter sat among them, not at the head, not removed, but present in a way that was entirely different from before, his posture composed, his attention focused, and though the position had changed, there was no resistance in him now, only observation, analysis, and something new taking shape beneath it all. Ava did not treat him differently, did not single him out, did not diminish or elevate him, because the structure she had built did not rely on personal dynamics. It relied on clarity, and within that clarity, everyone had a place, defined not by history, but by contribution. "We are not restructuring," she said calmly, her eyes moving across the room, meeting each executive with quiet certainty. "We are refining what already works." The distinction landed, just as her words always did, clean, direct, leaving no space for misinterpretation, and the room responded not with questions, but with understanding. Ethan watched her as she spoke, not as a man observing a replacement, but as someone recognizing a leader he had never fully seen. And with that recognition came something deeper than regret, something closer to accountability, because he could now trace every moment where he had overlooked what was standing directly in front of him. The meeting moved forward with precision, each department aligning with the updated strategy, each executive stepping into their role without hesitation. And as it concluded, there was no lingering uncertainty, only direction, the kind that did not need to be enforced because it was already accepted. Ava gathered her notes with the same calm efficiency, her movements unhurried, and as the room began to clear, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, watching the space shift around her, the way people deferred without being told, the way authority followed her without needing to be asserted. When the last of the executives had left, he stood, walking toward her with measured steps, his expression steady, no longer searching, no longer resisting, but grounded in something that had taken him longer than he expected to reach. "You did not just build a system," he said quietly. "You built trust into it." Ava looked at him, her gaze steady, and for a brief moment, there was that same faint acknowledgement, the one that did not need to be spoken. "Systems fail without it," she replied simply. Ethan nodded, the truth of it settling fully now, because he had seen what happened when trust was assumed instead of understood, when presence was overlooked instead of recognized, and standing there in a company that had shifted without breaking, he realized that what Ava had done was not replace him. It was reveal the foundation he had never taken the time to fully see. "Then I have work to do," he said, his voice even, carrying no weight of loss, only direction, because for the first time, he understood that his role moving forward would not be defined by what he had been, but by what he was willing to become. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not granting permission, not offering approval, but acknowledging the choice for what it was. Outside the conference room, the company continued its quiet momentum, no longer divided between past and present, but aligned towards something more stable, more precise, more real, and within that movement, The story that had begun with control had shifted into something far more enduring, something built not on authority alone, but on understanding, the kind that does not fade when the room changes, but strengthens with it. The rhythm of the company no longer hesitated. It moved with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. And by late afternoon, the transition was no longer a topic of discussion. It was the reality everyone operated within, seamless, structured, and undeniably effective. Ava Brooks stood once again by the window of the executive office, the city stretching endlessly beyond her, its motion constant, its energy familiar, and yet for the first time, there was no contrast between what existed outside and what she had built inside, because both now moved with the same kind of clarity, the same kind of intention. Behind her, the office remained active, screens updating, calls coming in, decisions being executed with precision, and through it all, she remained steady, not overwhelmed, not rushed, simply present in a way that anchored everything around her. Ethan Carter had not left the floor, not out of obligation, but out of choice, moving through departments, observing quietly, listening more than speaking, noticing details he had once overlooked, the way teams communicated without friction, the way information flowed without delay, the way leadership no longer needed to assert itself to be followed. Each step revealed something new, not about the company, but about his understanding of it, because what he had once seen as control had only ever been surface, and what Ava had built beneath it had always been the real foundation. When he returned to the office, he did not interrupt, did not announce his presence. He simply entered, closing the doors softly behind him, and for a moment, he stood there, taking in the space not as something he had lost, but as something he was finally beginning to understand. Ava turned slightly, acknowledging him without breaking her focus, and there was no tension in the air, no unresolved conflict, only a quiet alignment that had replaced what once stood between them. The external response is stable, she said, her voice calm, referring to the market, the investors, the narrative that had already settled into place without disruption. There will be questions, but not resistance. Ethan nodded, his gaze moving briefly to the data on the screen, then back to her, because now he could see not just the outcome, but the design behind it. You made it impossible for them to push back, he said, not with admiration, not with surprise, but with understanding. Ava's expression remained composed. I made it unnecessary, she corrected, her tone even, reinforcing the difference that defined everything she did. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the distinction landing exactly where it needed to, because it was not about forcing acceptance, it was about removing the need for conflict entirely. He stepped further into the room, his movements steady, no longer measured against authority, but against intention, and as he stopped near the desk, there was no hesitation in his posture, only presence, grounded and aware. I was never paying attention to the right things, he said after a moment, his voice low, reflective, not seeking validation, not offering justification, simply stating a truth he could no longer ignore. Ava looked at him fully then, her gaze steady, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt different, not defined by position or past, but by clarity finally shared. You were paying attention to what you were taught mattered, she said quietly. That does not make you wrong. It just made you incomplete. The words did not carry judgment, only precision, and Ethan absorbed them without resistance, because for the first time, he understood that this was not about failure. It was about limitation, and limitations, once recognized, could be redefined. He nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, as if marking the moment internally, committing it not as a loss, but as a shift. Outside, the company continued forward, steady, aligned, no longer divided between what had been and what was becoming, because that division had already been resolved. Ava returned her attention to the final set of updates for the day, confirming what had already been set into motion, ensuring that nothing was left incomplete, because for her, completion was not an endpoint, it was a standard. Ethan remained where he was, not needing to move, not needing to speak, because the need to assert had been replaced by the need to understand, and in that quiet transformation, something stronger had taken its place. As the light outside began to shift, the city moving toward evening, the office held a different kind of stillness, not the tension of uncertainty, but the calm of structure that no longer needed to prove itself. And within that stillness, both of them stood not as opposites, not as past and present, but as two people finally aligned with the same truth, that power, when understood correctly, does not divide. It clarifies everything it touches.